It's a pleasure to welcome you here to a session on the future of global nuclear disarmament and the issue of proliferation. We have here a distinguished panel. I'm Promit Pal Chaudhary. I'm a journalist, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, but I'll just say a few words on the Aspen Institute, which is the co-sponsor for this event. We are an institute that runs a number of major foreign policy dialogues in the Track 2 1.5 level with 7 countries. And so we have an interest in almost every major aspect of foreign policy. But without much further ado, I'd like to ask Siddharth Vardarajan, chief editor of a rival newspaper, The Hindu, so I will not praise him too much, to make some welcoming remarks.
And here I was under the impression that there is no rival newspaper to The Hindu. But anyway. Customary conceit out of the way, may I welcome all of you to this session. I thank the Aspen Institute and the Austrian Embassy for inviting me to take part in this very important discussion. Mr. N.D. Jayaprakash and the audience reminded me that today, or this year, is the 25th anniversary of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, the first edition. The plan has been through an update and in a modified way has been sort of represented to the world. A working group under Mani Shankar Iyer's leadership, of which I was also privileged to take part, generated a report which has occasioned quite a lot of discussion. The topic for today, future of global nuclear disarmament and the issue of proliferation, is at one level, the composition of today's panel at one level is a little unusual, because you have an Austrian, a representative of Austria, which is an avowedly non-nuclear country. It is not only opposed to nuclear weapons, but also opposed to nuclear energy, and has very forthright views on non-proliferation and disarmament. And of course, you have a number of Indian speakers, not all of whom would necessarily represent the same point of view, but they come, broadly speaking, from a national standpoint. A country, India, which in 1998 declared itself to be a state possessing nuclear weapons. And I use this phrase in its elongated version as opposed to a nuclear weapon state to avoid the legal terminologies of what India was demonstrating to the world at that time. And in many ways, the world has come to recognize that the realities of nuclear weapons in the world today have clearly moved beyond what the drafters of the NPT had imagined. And recognizing these new realities and finding a way to pursue the goal of nuclear disarmament and the elimination of nuclear weapons under these changed circumstances, I think remains a very fundamental, essential and urgent pursuit, and one, I dare say, that unites a non-nuclear country like Austria and a country like India, which embraced nuclear weapons. This was a controversial decision that India took in '98. There were many who were not happy, many who accepted this as a necessary evil, a phrase that Dr. K. Subramaniam, one of the leading strategic thinkers of India, the late Dr. K. Subramaniam, regarded this as something that India was, in a way, forced to do because of the specific circumstances that it found itself in. But broadly speaking, India today is one of the, I would say, arguably the only state possessing nuclear weapons that at the official level, at the formal state governmental position level, is a active supporter and campaigner for the elimination of nuclear weapons in a time-bound fashion. And not only has produced an updated version of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, which in a way goes beyond the first edition, because the first edition was generated when India was not a state with nuclear weapons. But the updated version and the resolutions and proposals that India regularly places before the First Committee of the United Nations, and we will have more to say about this in today's discussion, but which focus on the importance of states possessing weapons, agreeing never, for example, to be the first to use them, or agreeing never to use them at all via a binding convention prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons. These are stands that India has taken, and despite the fact that it possesses nuclear weapons, and I think gives, in a way, a certain bridging. It bridges the gulf or the distance between Austria and India, although I'm sure that our Austrian colleague may have views on this, and our Indian respondents will also contribute to the discussion. So with these brief introductory remarks, I would now like to sketch out the way that we will proceed. We have a total of we will have initial remarks by Ambassador Alexander Kment, who is the Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Following his opening remarks, we will have a panel discussion where each of our panelists will respond and give their own views for 5 to 6 minutes. Among them will be myself. And then we will open the floor to a Q&A, at the end of which I will try to summarize the discussion and hopefully identify some common strands which will emerge from our discussion. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Ambassador Kment to make his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me, really, to be able to participate in today's discussion on nuclear weapons with as distinguished panel as this one. I will try to make a modest contribution to this debate and would ask you, that's the disclaimer, not to hold everything I say against the Austrian Foreign Ministry. But as you pointed out, the Austrian perspective is very different to the Indian one. Austria's view is that of a Central European EU member state, small, neutral state, not in NATO, a non-nuclear weapons state with a pronounced anti-nuclear policy enshrined in its constitution. We are today, of course, in a very privileged security environment, but not long ago, in the Cold War, both sides included scenarios of nuclear weapons use on Austrian territory. Therefore, multilateralism has been an essential component of Austrian security policy for the past 60 years, and as a host of one of the UN headquarters, we strongly believe that multilateral cooperation is the key to finding solutions to global challenges such as nuclear weapons. Just to flesh out the situation very briefly, there is still an estimated 17,000 to 20,000 nuclear weapons in the stocks of now 9 states possessing nuclear weapons, the 5 in the NPT, 3 outside of the NPT, including India, and the outlier, North Korea. US and Russia still possess more than 90% of stocks, and while the number of nuclear weapons among the NPT nuclear weapon states has gone down, there are comprehensive modernization plans in place in all 5 nuclear weapon states. At the same time, in Asia, given the significant upward trend in nuclear weapons and missile delivery system capabilities that we see worrying signs of an accelerating nuclear arms race involving India, Pakistan, and China. North Korea has by now conducted 3 nuclear tests and built up its missile capabilities. In the Middle East, all eyes are on the nuclear program of Iran and the fear about and the worries about its suspected military dimension. Prominent voices in the region already advocate nuclear armament for their own countries should Iran reach nuclear weapons capability. And while Israel sees Iran as a serious threat, its own policy of nuclear opacity has reached its limit in the discussion, in the course of the discussion on the Iranian nuclear program. So the global state of affairs of the nuclear regime is, if anything, getting increasingly complex and dangerous. The technological hurdle for obtaining nuclear weapons is getting lower by the day. More and more states and potentially non-state actors will be in a position to reach or cross nuclear weapons capability. And the decision to do that will be a political one more than a technological one. The consequences of this trend cannot be overstated. It means an exponentially increasing risk of nuclear weapons proliferation and consequently the risk of their use somewhere by someone. The only long-term approach is therefore to build political and legal barriers against nuclear weapons as such. A policy focus on non-proliferation, as important as it is ultimately doomed to fail. I've not heard of any fundamental reassessment of the role of nuclear weapons. States with them still posit their deterrence value and their role as ultimate guarantor of security. And this is remarkable given the widely held view that a nuclear standoff in the Cold War was actually a high-stake poker that humanity was rather lucky to escape unharmed. From our point of view, though, the deterrence logic is not more than a belief system, and we see it as an absurd belief system, absurd because of the unacceptable humanitarian consequences that any failure, accidental or deliberate, would cause. It is absurd to trust that nuclear deterrence can remain stable and provide security in the long run with an increasing number of nuclear-armed actors. And the reasoning that governments are rational enough to handle nuclear deterrence and that deterrence works because it makes governments act rational is essentially the most dangerous circular argument in human history. Some argue that nuclear weapons exist so that they are never used. But if deterrence is to be taken seriously, one also needs to discuss the concrete scenarios in which nuclear weapons would be used. But by which threat today could one possibly justify a nuclear strike on population centers like New York, Moscow, Karachi, or Mumbai, the killing of millions and the severest global humanitarian, environmental, health, and economic consequences? I would like to recommend reading a recent study called Nuclear Famine, 1 Billion People at Risk. It's based on new research on Earth and climate models, and it's based on a scenario of a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. And it calculates the resulting global drop in temperature and impact on global food production. The conclusion for me is that nothing really justifies nuclear weapons, and the key argument that remains for the retention is the existence of nuclear arsenals in other states that are maintained because of a similar belief in nuclear deterrence. To quote the late Rajiv Gandhi, nuclear deterrence is the ultimate expression of the philosophy of terrorism, holding humanity hostage to the presumed security needs of a few, end of quote. There's also a strong psychological element associated to nuclear weapons, its power status and the ability of projecting this power. And it is telling that the permanent membership of the Security Council has somehow become equated with nuclear weapon status, although it has, of course, nothing to do with it. There is a lure of power and technological sophistication associated with these weapons in all nuclear possessors, but let me give you one example that I picked up from a newspaper in India, not represented here. The Indian Express on 10th of February ran the headline, quote, "India working on Agni-6 missile to be in world's elite nuclear club," end of quote. Equipping nuclear weapons with these elite attributes has been a tragic misjudgment by all possessors. This is one of the key drivers for the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the current proliferation challenges North Korea and Iran are also motivated largely by these attributes. If nuclear possessors do not end their own infatuation with nuclear weapons, they will continue to effectively encourage the quest for nuclear weapons by others. But ultimately, we need to have answers to two key questions. How do nuclear weapon states envisage that a system based on deterrence can provide stability in the long run with an increasing number of nuclear actors, or potentially increasing number of actors? And secondly, how do they think they can prevent proliferation if they are not credibly reducing the importance of nuclear weapons for themselves, actually doing the opposite by modernizing or extending their arsenals? All possessors have embraced the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, but of course there are serious question marks as to whether there is a real readiness for nuclear disarmament as against limited arms control or arms reduction measures. But given the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons, most states see it as unacceptable that such an existential threat to all humankind continues to be handled by a few states as a national security matter. As an issue of global concern, it requires a global and multilateral approach. But this multilateral approaches that we see the processes are unfortunately flawed and dominated by tactics to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. Consequence of this is an increasing erosion of legal regimes and frameworks that we have. And I believe states possessing nuclear weapons have the prime responsibility to prevent this through their own actions. There's also a need for a much broader discourse on nuclear weapons, such as a real critical analysis of the validity of nuclear deterrence in the 21st century, the threat perceptions of today that are used to justify nuclear deterrence, and the proliferation risk that the policies of the possessors of nuclear weapons generate. However, the nuclear weapons issue should not be limited to security policy circles. There should be a much broader international risk analysis weighing the policies of a few states against the risk of inflicting unacceptable humanitarian consequences to all humankind. How we deal with nuclear weapons is a litmus test for the international community. If I may close with a few personal observations on India in this context. Indian personalities were among the most outspoken leaders in the NAM that pinpointed the folly of the bipolar nuclear confrontation. On the way here, I reread the beautiful Rajiv Gandhi speech at the General Assembly in '88, and it's still very true today, also in making a compelling case that the elimination of nuclear weapons is the only sustainable way to solve the nuclear dilemma. Today, however, there appears to be a disconnect between the disarmament rhetoric and the realpolitik that we see. Nuclear disarmament remains, of course, a very strongly formulated aspirational Indian goal for the future. At the same time, what we perceive as a qualitative and quantitative buildup of India's nuclear weapons and delivery systems in itself contributes to the condition that the goal remains distant. India also still points to the discriminatory nature of the nuclear regime, but is this still true today for India? Nuclear commerce has been opened for India in 2008, despite the fact that India is not a member of the NPT. So today, India effectively has the rights, but not the obligations from the NPT. For a start, India is neither legally bound by NPT Article 6, nor politically bound by the disarmament commitments of 95, 2000, and 2010. And while the nuclear weapon states in the NPT are, from the Austrian perspective, certainly not living up to the implementation of their disarmament commitments, they are nevertheless accountable within this legally binding context. And there's nothing comparable in place for India. So we see two distinct types of discrimination, I believe. One is the one that India has argued against, the discrimination against its own aspiration and self-image to be a nuclear weapon state. But there is today an added level of discrimination, and that is particularly also perceived as that in the non-aligned movement, that the NPT rights of cooperation in peaceful uses of nuclear energy can also be had without entering the significant NPT legal obligations that they have undertaken. And I think this is one of the important elements that contribute to the increased loss of legitimacy of the regime at large. It needs to be addressed seriously, since the entire international community stands to lose if the regime is weakened. So India's past ambiguity against the NPT and against the CTBT for that matter, based on the discrimination argument, may no longer be a dominant issue. I hope that they could be replaced by a very proactive Indian role to achieve nuclear disarmament. Instead of waiting for the US and Chinese ratification of the CTBT, for instance, I would hope that India could take the lead on this and create the political momentum for the other Annex II states. I hope that India could look at the concrete NPT disarmament commitments and, of course, while not being bound by them, be an example to the NPT nuclear weapon states on how these commitments are acted upon with actually a serious intent of achieving the goal. This would be consistent with a moral stance on nuclear weapons that the non-aligned movement still promotes, and that India was so instrumental in the past to formulate, and that Austria, of course, fully shares. So with this, I want to end my remarks. My main purpose for coming here to Delhi is to learn about the Indian views. So I thank you very much again for this great opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
I would now like to invite Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer to make his remarks. He's a member of Parliament for the Rajya Sabha.
Mr. Knet, I'm afraid I'm absolutely the wrong one to begin with expressing to you an Indian view, because the view that I have is not, I think, an Indian view, but it is the view of an Indian. The problem, of course, is Vienna. That's where the problem began, and it's ironic that the Austrian embassy should be organizing this, for it was in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna that you made a doctrine out of the balance of power, and that completely obscurantist and totally disastrous policy, which eventually led to the First and the Second World Wars, is been the doctrine that has been the most important in justifying the existence and continuance of nuclear weapons. And I don't think it can be opposed without completely giving up concepts of the balance of power as the way of maintaining the peace and replacing it instead with doctrines of peaceful coexistence, which even as you have given up the doctrine of the balance of power in Vienna, we are giving up the doctrine of peaceful coexistence in India. So we are both sinners, and that's perhaps why we've got together today. There is a distinction to be drawn between unilateral disarmament and multilateral disarmament. And while I personally am entirely in favor of our unilaterally giving up the bomb, now that we've got it, we're hugging onto it like a teddy bear, and I'm absolutely sure that India will not unilaterally give up its bomb. So while I've fought many lost causes, this is a lost cause which I've accepted as lost. But it is possible for India, as Siddharth pointed out, to be the vanguard state among those who actually possess nuclear weapons, to place and then pursue a program of global nuclear disarmament. Now, this global nuclear disarmament has to be based on certain principles where even if you remove one of these straws, the rest of the structure falls down. It must be universal. It must be non-discriminatory in the sense that its provisions apply to everyone uniformly. It must be time-bound, either in the sense of determining in advance which is the time frame within which the process will be completed. It must alternatively be one where the first element of the negotiation is to decide, at least provisionally, that this is the time frame within which it will be completed. Otherwise, it's left completely open-ended, and the reduction of nuclear weapons does not amount to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Furthermore, it must be a process that necessarily has to be phased. It cannot be done in one fell sweep. It must also be a process that is verifiable. If these principles are observed, and they lie at the base of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan of 1988, then it is possible to go forward. But if we are going to try and bring that within a regime which is patently discriminatory, in the sense that back in 1967, those who had nuclear weapons said that we will have one set of rules for ourselves, which is unenforceable, a bit like the directive principles of state policy in the Indian Constitution, whereas the measures for those countries that don't have nuclear weapons are to be enforced, not just enforceable, but to be enforced, and enforced with the most ruthless measures that resulted in Iraq losing 500,000 children during the 1990s, and then suffering an invasion which only proved the point that some of us who've actually served in Iraq suspected that the Iraqis couldn't have made a bomb. And now we seem to be confronted with the same situation vis-à-vis Iran, I think the two most interesting things about the potential invasion of Iran to stop it from making the bomb, or rather there are three. Number one is that in Tony Blair's autobiography, there's this gorgeous sentence which I think should be written up in letters of gold at the Foreign Office in Whitehall, which is that if only Saddam Hussein had done the same thing as Gaddafi, we would not have needed to invade Iraq. He followed this up by invading Libya. The second is the irony of the fact that you're getting ready to invade Iran and getting ready not to invade North Korea, because North Korea has shown that it does have the bomb, that it is not going to follow the Gaddafi route of giving it up, and therefore there's more persuasion involved with a declared, self-declared nuclear weapon, state with nuclear weapons, than there is with regard to a state which keeps avowing that it does not have a nuclear weapon program and wishes only to ensure that its rights under the NPT are in fact justified. And the third is that the principal reason why Iran has a nuclear weapons program is because of a state that you did not mention in your listing of Asian countries, which is Israel. Israel has the bomb. Everyone knows it, except that the Israelis don't declare it, and the Americans refuse to invade Israel to take away the bomb from them. So we have a very, very odd situation where the political system is designed to maintain inequalities, and the hope is that we will arrive at the containment of the dangers of nuclear weapons through an asymmetrical treaty. And I think the most significant element to the 1988 plan was the rejection, well, actually it started earlier. In 1974, there was a rejection by Mrs. Indira Gandhi of the idea that the world could be divided into nuclear weapon powers and non-nuclear weapon powers, that is, into NWPs and double NWPs. For she put forward a third category, which was the threshold nuclear weapon power. And the explosion at Pokhran showed that there were countries which could make the bomb, but which were unilaterally deciding not to go forward to making the bomb. And this was made even clearer in the 1988 speech at the UN by Rajiv Gandhi, where he explicitly talked of countries having the capacity to make the bomb and then unilaterally deciding to restrain themselves at the threshold, and indicating that if the world doesn't move in the direction of Article 6 of the NPT, then those who are on this side of the threshold might well be tempted to cross the threshold and get onto the other side of the threshold. And India has, since 1998, done that. But having done that, we have declared ourselves to be willing only to cross the nuclear weapon threshold and not to get onto the nuclear escalator. There is to be a credible minimum nuclear deterrent. What makes it a little lack credibility is that we haven't said what constitutes the minimum or what constitutes the credible, but still in doctrine terms, there is a rejection of the idea that we would have to go in for nuclear escalation in order to keep up with the other side, and we haven't even decided what the other side is, although the assumption is made quite reasonably that the other side we think of is usually Pakistan, but that we really have an arrière-pensée about China. The fact is that no nuclear war can be restricted as a conventional war can to the battlefield. The consequences spread very much further. So in these circumstances, I think I've run out of my time, but basically what I want to urge is that we cannot expect to contain the nuclear menace by having asymmetrical international arrangements, that there is a possibility of doing this through symmetrical arrangements, such as those mentioned in the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, the working paper that was later submitted by India to the United Nations in 2006, and by the refinements that we have attempted to make in the report that we presented to the Prime Minister about 1.5 years ago. And that the only way forward is to go back to the Conference on Disarmament and discuss this. Where there is a deadlock, with the Pakistanis saying they will not negotiate the FMCT, and citing the argument that the Americans have said that they will not discuss nuclear disarmament because there must be a rule where everybody has to agree on what to discuss before it can be discussed. In other words, the Americans have been hoist with their own petard, and unless we can break out of this, either by saying, let's put FMCT to one side, or that all of us who want the FMCT unilaterally declare that we are going to observe its provisions, or say that while this is not being discussed, we do agree that we don't need the agreement of everyone to start discussing nuclear disarmament. And in the meanwhile, for India to take the initiative in going to the US, the USSR, then the other nuclear weapon states, then the states with nuclear weapons, and then the potential SNWs, and then finally the international community to try and get the negotiations on nuclear disarmament started, because they never really did start. There were indications that they might start. In fact, the very first resolution of the United Nations was that they would start, and I think perhaps 68 years is long enough to have waited to start this process. And I have two alternative suggestions to you. One, immediately through the CD by the method I mentioned, and if you find that impractical, then by the process of indulging in a series of bilateral negotiations, which will eventually set the stage for multilateral discussions at the CD, leading to multilateral negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, so Manishankar Iyer. Our next speaker will be Ambassador Kamal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary. Sir.
Maybe I can speak from here.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to address specifically some of the points Mr. Comment raised. And in that process, of course, I will be also in some sense conveying what what my thinking is. To follow Manishankar, I'm also speaking as an Indian, not on behalf of India. First of all, if Austria were India, I wouldn't expect Mr. Comment to take the position that he has taken. The security challenges that India faces are altogether different from the ones that Austria faces. If Austria had two nuclear weapon states bordering it, and they were collaborating with each other, then I think this kind of idealistic position, which appeals obviously to one's ethical, moral, and other considerations, I don't deny that, but I don't think Austria would be in a position to adopt a position like that. Austria can look upon the nuclear debate or nuclear weapons as a global challenge, because it is not affecting you directly. It's not a challenge that is pressing you directly on your borders. So you can take a large, detached, global view of the situation and adopt a discourse which responds to that amorphous global challenge that you see pervades across the world, but it doesn't directly press immediately on Austria, where the Austrians have to take urgent decisions for their security. But for us, it is a regional challenge, of course, but it is a very pressing bilateral challenge, given the fact that we have Pakistan and China in our neighborhood. I also don't accept the argument that India is engaged in an nuclear arms race. In fact, our whole conduct, right from the start, has been very reluctant in terms of acquiring nuclear capability. We did have some kind of a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, and then we waited 24 years. 24 years, despite the fact that in the meantime, Pakistan had become a nuclear weapons state in 1989. The collaboration between China and Pakistan was known. Now, of course, a lot of information has come out about the nature of that close collaboration. But we stayed our hand because we didn't want to become nuclear. Until after the end of the Cold War, the Americans took this position publicly, formally, that their aim was to eliminate, to freeze, roll back, to cap, freeze, roll back, and eliminate India's nuclear capability. And for that, they launched the idea of the CTBT and the FMCT, and they made no effort to disguise the real intention that the target was India. And we were then confronted with a situation where we had to either forever forego becoming nuclear or take the plunge, which we did. And in any case, professionally, I've told the Americans that you've been responsible for pushing us into becoming an overt nuclear power because we were quite ready to remain a latent nuclear power, to keep a latent nuclear capability. After that, we have declared our intentions to acquire a nuclear triad and to have a delivery capability, but it's not as if we are pumping in millions and billions of dollars and having a test every other day of our missiles. In fact, Pakistan is conducting far more tests of delivery vehicles than we are. We are doing it at a very steady pace, perhaps once a year or things like that. So we are acting responsibly because we don't want to enter into a nuclear arms race, but we want to have a credible minimum nuclear deterrent that we have declared. If Pakistan feels that it must match India, if Pakistan wants to acquire parity, as they want to do in everything vis-a-vis India, then the arms race is not being provoked by us. It's Pakistan's own choice that they want. We are not trying to acquire the same level of nuclear capability as China. Forget the United States of America, even China. If China is willing to live with a smaller nuclear arsenal and capability vis-a-vis the United States, we are also willing to live with a relatively smaller nuclear capability and delivery capability vis-a-vis China. So we have no intention to match them. Similarly, if Pakistan was to behave rationally, they need not want to acquire parity with India, in which case, therefore, you would not have the appearance of some kind of arms race going on in the subcontinent. You mentioned that more and more states can become nuclear weapon countries, and it's a political decision, not a technical decision. I'm not too sure about that, because until recently, not a single Islamic state, except Iran, which Russia has built the nuclear reactor, had any nuclear reactor. Some of them had some experimental reactors, like Egypt, but they've gone into disuse. Now the UAE and others want to acquire nuclear reactors, but until recently, not a single Islamic state, leave aside others, many others, who actually had even a nuclear power station or any form of nuclear reactor. Therefore, unless the Western countries, nuclear suppliers, China or others, want to build nuclear reactors in these countries and give them the potential then to break out at some later stage after they've mastered this technology, then the question has to be posed very differently. It has to be posed very differently. So I don't think that there are threshold states which are waiting to become nuclear and they have the capability, and suddenly we'll have so many countries which will become nuclear weapon states. That's not the position, actually, unless, of course, as I said, the nuclear suppliers begin building nuclear power plants and transferring nuclear technology to a large number of states, then you may have a problem. Insofar as the question of, you mentioned the danger of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. Now, it's all right as an argument. You can postulate a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, a nuclear war. Why not between France and the UK, if not now, some decades from now, or between France, UK, and Russia. But I don't know why there is this belief that India and Pakistan will engage in a nuclear war. Because from our point of view, we have no intention to pursue a policy towards Pakistan which would put the sovereignty and the existence of Pakistani as a state in danger. And if we are not going to do that, then why should there be a nuclear war between India and Pakistan? But if Pakistan, because it wants Kashmir, and since it can't have Kashmir, at some stage decides that, I'm not saying they're going to do it, but if some stage decides that they must threaten India directly with nuclear weapons, etc., it's a different matter. But why should there be assumption that India and Pakistan will enter into a nuclear? In fact, if you look at the statements that are coming from Russia, which are actually far more aggressive than any statements that India has never made a statement like that, or for that matter, any statement Pakistan has made against India. On this question of ABM, Russia is clearly saying that if you do this, then we're going to target the missiles in Poland and Romania, whatever, and we'll move missiles in the enclave they have near Poland. And they are actually saying they are developing delivery systems and new submarines which would counter any potential threat from the United States of America. The language is quite robust, and yet nobody talks about the potential of a war, nuclear war between the United States and Russia. So why this assumption that India and Pakistan will somehow behave like madmen and go in for a nuclear holocaust? Now, if you believe that Pakistan can behave irrationally, then you must do something about Pakistan. Because Pakistan is a country where you have nuclear capability, you have terrorism, and you have religious fundamentalism. All the three ingredients which are very toxic and which should worry the rest of the world. But in actual fact, what do we see? As Manish Shankar just mentioned, Pakistan is not allowing FMCT discussions to continue. And somehow one finds that the United States and the entire world is helpless. They can't push a country like Pakistan to end its opposition. If China is behind Pakistan and Pakistan gets diplomatic and political support from China, then again, I think it's a matter of concern that China is playing this sort of a role. Then recently, China announced that it is supplying 2 nuclear power reactors to Pakistan. The United States hasn't opposed it. The NSG hasn't done anything about it. So why is there such insouciance, such a lack of concern, given the instability in Pakistan, where at the same time everybody is saying that, Pakistan is a failing state, may tomorrow actually become a failed state, and the Islamic extremist groups may get a finger on the Pakistani nuclear trigger. Despite that, you're allowing this to happen. Pakistan is now building reprocessing Kushab 1, 2, 3, and they'll build 3 and 4 also. They're going into plutonium production. And then if you contrast this with the attitude that is being taken towards North Korea, but leave that aside, but Iran, the whole attitude is so different in terms of not ruling out even a military threat against Iran. So there are 2 neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran, one doing what it is doing in terms of expanding its nuclear power program. And the world is saying, the Americans and others are saying that their nuclear program is, in fact, expanding very rapidly, very, very rapidly. And yet nothing is being done. It is being put aside, whereas the whole focus is Iran. So there are these contradictions. So let me end by saying that, in fact, if India and Pakistan are 2 nuclear countries, are neighbors, it is not necessarily a recipe for disaster. After all, if France and UK are 2 nuclear countries, but there is no issue there in terms of 2 neighbors being nuclear weapon states. It's a question of a relationship between the 2 countries. France and Germany, France is a nuclear weapon state, Germany is not. But look at, they are the pillar and the core of the European Union. So the problem is in the political relationship between India and Pakistan. And to my mind, as an Indian, I think the problem is on the Pakistani side, and you should perhaps do something about it. I have one more last point to make, which is that now India is no longer a victim of the NPT discriminatory regime. To the extent that we have been now under the NSG approval, we can now have access to natural uranium And in principle, countries can also build power reactors. To that extent, yes, this was a provision of the NPT itself, but the whole thing had been distorted by the US and others imposing sanctions that has been lifted. But India has entered into a nuclear deal with the United States, which contains in it many clauses which no other nuclear weapon state or self-declared nuclear weapon state has had to accept. Whether it is the separation of the civilian and nuclear assets of India, whether it is the right to return, that in case we tested under any certain circumstances, then everything will be taken back. And of course, we are not legally recognized as a nuclear weapon state. And then there's a question mark on full civilian nuclear cooperation, because the Americans have made it clear they will not transfer reprocessing technologies to us. And in fact, the reprocessing plant that will be built in India will be subject to monitoring by the United States without giving any technical help for that. But there is an issue there. Therefore, I don't think that one can make the argument as simply as you made, that India is no longer, India is a full-fledged member of the benefits of the NPT in terms of access to nuclear technology.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sibbal. I'd now like to invite Pramit Pal Chaudhary, who's the Foreign Affairs Editor of Hindustan Times.
I don't think anybody really opposes the idea of global disarmament, global nuclear disarmament. I mean, it's very hard to find an argument for keeping nuclear weapons. But as far as I can see, for us to accomplish this immediately, you would, among other things, have to solve the Arab-Israeli problem, somehow knock out the North Korean regime, end all the distrust between India, Pakistan, and China, explain to the French and the British, who still have nuclear weapons for reasons I've never fully understood, and a number of other accomplishments. Or conversely, we should have Austria take over the world. Both of them strike me as being unlikely to happen in any conceivable short period of time. So, and as a consequence, the international system has a process which I think is completely sensible, which is to do it bit by bit. The first game was, of course, the Soviet Union and America to reduce their armaments because they were at the heart of much of this. And then to slowly do things like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, and of course the existing nuclear non-proliferation technology regimes, Wassenaar, the Australia group is chemical weapons, Wassenaar and things like the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is about delivery, nuclear delivery lessons, and of course the Nuclear Suppliers Group itself. So let's say what India does. What is India doing in these areas right now? In the case of the CTBT, the Test Ban Treaty, India has made it very clear. We will sign the treaty when China and the United States ratify the treaty. Now, it's important to realize that China, or at least I think China and definitely America have signed a treaty, but they have not ratified. Because under their legal systems, ratification and signature are two different processes. In India, signature is automatic ratification. It does not have to go to Parliament. So for us, in effect, we're saying that we will not ratify that. When we're saying we won't sign it, we're actually saying we will not ratify the treaty until these other two countries will do so. Given that India is a relatively small nuclear power compared to these two nations, and given that we live in a relatively enough neighborhood, and as you know, Pakistan has said that we will follow, and has an almost unspoken, unwritten understanding with India, we will follow the day India does. The chain of events is relatively clear. Now, the problem has been basically the United States, which has been unable, despite repeated attempts by its own presidents, to get its own Senate to approve the ratification for various number of problems regarding monitoring and so on. And it's stuck there. But in the meantime, what is happening is a de facto moratorium on nuclear testing. Nobody, frankly, other than North Korea, which has made it clear it doesn't plan to sign the CTBT under any circumstances, as far as I can see, will carry out a test. So I think the CTBT, in effect, is now becoming a norm without becoming a treaty. And I presume at some point, if Obama gets a majority in the Senate he will attempt to push that through at some point. So I'm not overly concerned about the CTBT. I think that is in many ways in place within the international mainstream. On the nuclear non-proliferation technology regimes, India, and as part of the understanding that we had with the Americans, and the American government has supported Obama, he supported this when he came here on his first state visit to India, membership in Wassenaar, in MTCR, the Australia Group, and the NSG. All of this, however, now is tied up because China and its allies, or Pakistan's allies, have basically said that we'll veto this, will not allow this to happen. And so India, in many ways, at least as far as India is concerned, we're still a little outside the club because these are at the core, in many ways, of being a member of the nuclear club in terms of actual substantive ability to make rules, to control rules, and to have access to technology. So we're halfway there, but we are not, and for the time being, so it's not clear to me that we're going to get that unless at least China decides to change its position regarding us. The fissile material cutoff treaty, however, is I think probably the most interesting one of these treaties because as been mentioned earlier, it's Pakistan that's blocking that treaty. And I think for India, the question that we are going to have to face, which I don't think we have really looked at closely yet, or we're looking at it, but not in, I think, any seriously coherent manner, and I think would probably wait until it spills over into the public sphere, is the fact that Pakistan is rapidly accelerating its accumulation of fissile material, much faster than India is. In fact, it's already ahead of us in terms of fissile material, though may not be in terms of warheads. We don't exactly know how many kilograms of plutonium or enriched uranium its warheads have. And that acceleration is going to continue. The core question really is why is Pakistan doing this? Because it doesn't seem to be based on any clear doctrinal base. The normal game is you have a doctrine and then you fit your missile basing and your numbers according to the doctrine. We don't see that clearly in Pakistan. And we have an assumption, and as has been mentioned, that it is a psychological problem. In other words, countries have developed, there is a nuclear weapons mystique, which I think has been mentioned by some of the others. And countries that feel under siege, or countries, on the other hand, who feel that they are rising, feel often that they need to have nuclear weapons. My sense is that in Pakistan's case, it's a country, and when I've talked to other analysts on Pakistan, there's a broad agreement, I would argue, on that it's a country that feels it's under siege. It's definitely things are not going well inside Pakistan, irrespective of what happens in India. And its problems internally are making it feel the need to develop more and more nuclear weapons as compensation. The social psychology of nuclear weapons is a broad and expanding field. One of my friends, Jacques Hymans, has written extensively on this. The exact opposite, I would argue, is actually true for India. I think I would agree with Ambassador Sybil that, in fact, India has been a very reluctant participant in the nuclear weapons program. But as I mentioned, like France and Britain still having nuclear weapons makes very little sense to anybody that I can think of. The Irish are no longer quite the threat they used to be. And I'm not certain what the French are scared of, but they still have nuclear weapons. It seems largely for prestige purposes. So we need to keep in mind that within the FMCT continues to be stuck, as I mentioned, is of Pakistan. But because we have a country that, in my view, has if you wish, a social psychological issue. And therefore, FMCT, I am particularly pessimistic about its future. And it's not clear to me what India can do because it really has to do with a much broader question of the stabilization of Pakistan itself. So in this context, when you're looking at the nuclear proliferation, the FMCT, I think, is the core problem. More than any of the others, I think this is the core of the issue. And it's going to have to be addressed by the issue of Pakistan's psychology itself. And as I said, the problem that I feel I'm concerned about India is that as in Pakistan's fissile material buildup continues, at present it hasn't caused almost any concern in India. In fact, it's quite amazing how little impact the fact that repeated reports about the fact that Pakistan has overtaken us and fissile material has anything. At some point, however, when Pakistan becomes, let's say, a nuclear weapons arsenal of 50% more than India, 100% more than India, there's going to be, in my view, some sort of a reaction in the public sphere. And definitely at the political sphere, it will be tempting for a politician to raise this and say, why is this happening? Kennedy did it with a missile gap. We could potentially have the same. So for me, the global disarmament issue is all very nice, but I think the core of it, preserving what we have already accomplished or are accomplishing in nuclear non-proliferation, at the core of that lies in trying to see what can be done about Pakistan, because otherwise we do have a potential, as I said, for an arms race mentality inside South Asia. It's not something India is doing. I completely agree with Ambassador Sybil. Our accretion of fissile material is very small. If I'm correct, the Americans tell me we build 2 or 3 Agni missiles every year, and we destroy one of them by testing it. This is an accretion. That means in 50 years we'll have 100 missiles, maybe. That's extremely slow. So I think that is the core of the issue, as far as I'm concerned, on a much more practical, I'm a journalist, I'm not a strategist, a much more practical issue of what we have already accomplished and are trying to preserve in nuclear non-proliferation today.
Thank you. I'm more comfortable speaking standing up. A lot has already been said to enrich the debate which Ambassador Kment started. I would just like to bring the focus back to the international arena. And it's my sense that the fundamental flaw in the NPT and the entire regime that has been constructed upon the NPT, the arms control and non-proliferation regime, is that the approach has been one of taking as given that those who legally possess nuclear weapons will continue to do so without any binding obligation to give them up. And the entire focus of the architecture of the system is in preventing countries that might think about getting nuclear weapons, finding ways to prevent them from doing so. And the approach, the prevention approach, has focused more on the technological side. So in what way is the CTBT or the FMCT a building block for disarmament? Well, only insofar as it prevents a state which doesn't have nuclear weapons from testing one and going nuclear, or a state that doesn't possess fissile material from manufacturing it and going on to build a nuclear weapon. It is my sense, I think, what Pramit said, that the CTBT, the norm against testing, other than the DPRK, today it's very, very hard to imagine a situation where countries are, where any of the declared states possessing nuclear weapons will start to test. If anything, I would say, just as the chain of causality, the link, the ratification chain is most effective if it starts with the US and China. If the US and China do so, India is guaranteed to come on board. If India comes on board, it's almost certain that Pakistan will face enormous pressure to do so. Israel and Iran are sui generis, but the world will have to come to that equation as well. As an Indian, I can say it's impossible, and I would say unfair to expect Pakistan to ratify the CTBT before India does. And likewise, India is not going to do it before the US and China. And the same is true of testing, that I can't think of a situation where, if you were to ask, other than DPRK, which country has lobbies which are, in a way, still thinking that there's a logic to testing. Well, it's the United States. So the sequence of test violations would be that the US would test, followed by China, followed by India, followed by Pakistan, rather than the other way around. So the issue really is to focus energies, and if to the extent to which we believe the CTBT is important and essential, and you want to lock it in place, maximum pressure really needs to be exerted by all countries who believe this is so essential on the United States and China, and in particular the United States. But there it's a very politically driven process, and it's very hard to imagine that any forward movement will happen in the next 4 to 8 years, quite frankly. My sense is that instead of focusing exclusively on the technical fixes, the CTBTs and the FMCTs, which are important, it's the political side of the equation. And I think here what Mr. Manishankar has said, that if you look at the politics of arms control and non-proliferation the way it plays out, what effect does the ease with which North Korea is getting away with its testing have on the internal debate within Iran on the possession of nuclear weapons? The Iranians will look but they will compare the fate of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un and say, well, yes, nuclear weapons are a ticket to regime security. So I think the big powers also need to reevaluate the way in which the use of conventional force, say in the case against Iraq, in pursuit of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, has actually pushed or created incentives for countries to acquire nuclear weapons. And this is something which is really quite independent of the FMCT, CTBT. So regardless of the progress that's been made in establishing the no testing as a norm, the big powers, through their political and strategic and military actions, are actually creating political arguments every day for regimes that feel threatened or uncomfortable to actually contemplate acquiring nuclear weapons. And I think this is an essential, something that we need to factor into our discussions at the global level. Coming to some of Ambassador Clement's observations on India, I think Pramit is quite right that and also what Ambassador Sybil said, that the entry that, or the exemption that India won from the NSG is not something that has come free. I mean, those of you who followed the very, very bruising debate in India will know how difficult it was for this country to come up to that stage where it was ready to sign that agreement with the United States and to accept the NSG's conditions. Today, as a result of this agreement, Ambassador Clement, you said that India is not, there are no obligations that India has accepted. Well, a lot more of India's nuclear facilities are under international safeguards, and a larger and larger proportion of it will come under safeguards than would have happened had this entire deal process not happened. And this is a reality, and this is a controversial point. I mean, many advocates of the maximalist position in India on nuclear weapons are very, very upset, and some of which, the full implications of which we still don't know. And this is another point of controversy in this country. But where you are right is that, yes, it's not, there is, if you ask, are there legally binding disarmament obligations like Article 6? Clearly not. But Article 6, I would say, is virtually a dead letter in legal terms, because absent any time-bound restriction, it's something which exists purely on paper. And here I believe that the contributions that India has been trying to make as a state, as a responsible state possessing nuclear weapons, in trying to push the debate forward, trying to create common ground for states that possess nuclear weapons to be more responsible in the way they possess them, to begin talking about a no first use agreement, for example, to begin talking about a convention against nuclear weapons. And here I would like to say it would be nice. India annually presents a resolution in the first committee, which Austria regularly votes against. It would be nice if Austria would lend its weight to the Indian proposal in the first committee, which calls for a lot of the issues that we've been discussing today. And I think this is precisely where the common ground can be established between a country like India, which is really unique. I mean, there is no other nuclear weapon state that has a position, an official position, where it is saying, look, let us start negotiations on the time-bound elimination, on a convention prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons, because you can only think about eliminating nuclear weapons if they are removed from the hands of generals as part of a military strategy or part of their military inventory. And you can only do that if you actually put in place a prohibition on their use. So I think these are, this is a different vector, if you like, from the vector that has been pursued over the years through the NPT system. But I dare say it's one that is more likely to produce results, precisely because it focuses on delegitimizing nuclear weapons as weapons of war, as weapons that you can actually use. And I think while we should pursue the FMCT track vigorously, we should not be blind to, or we should not ignore the fact that we may need to create other fora or create other avenues for discussion, particularly among states that possess nuclear weapons, so that there can be some understanding on delegitimizing nuclear weapons as a military, reducing their salience to begin with and delegitimizing them as instruments of war. Last couple of points. The NSG. What India won in 2008 was an exemption from the NSG's restrictions. And as I said, this didn't come without India making a number of concessions, some of which, Ambassador Quent, you're right, are in the nature of political declarations. But many of them actually, if you look at the way, the interconnected nature of the Safeguards Agreement, the Additional Protocol, the 123 Agreement, many of these represent significant concessions that India has had to make, which other states possessing nuclear weapons have not had to make. And I think that the logical next step is for India to, in a way, what India was declaring was its willingness to actually come and work together with the rest of the international community for strengthening the international regime against and to work against the spread of nuclear weapons. Membership of NSG is one important aspect of this, which India has set as a priority. And I think that a country like Austria, given the fact that despite the disagreements in today's discussions, the broad goals that Ambassador Quent outlined, and which all of these, you notice there's a lot of differences of opinion in all of us who've spoken from the Indian side. But there is a fundamental thread running through, which is that none of us actually subscribe to the kind of maximalist positions that other nuclear weapon states have pursued in the past. So I think that creating this common ground, when India tested in '98, there was you're right, you refer to some of these headlines about joining an elite club. There was a lot of irresponsible talk, particularly in the media, and some of this continues to persist, where people see nuclear weapons and missiles as tickets to passports to the so-called high table. But if you look at the way in which the discourse has settled today and the kind of positions that India is espousing, I think you would find that there's a lot more that India and Austria would have in common that they can build upon to pursue this common goal of ridding the world of nuclear weapons through a time-bound process with very definite goalposts built along the way. Those are my remarks, and I would now like to open the floor for discussions. And Ambassador Quent, you'll have your say to respond to everything that you've heard so far. Sir.
Ambassador Quent, at the end of 1998, a book on global nuclear disarmament was reviewed in the UN Chronicle in New York, following which the UN Secretary General sent a statement from it to all conferences on nuclear disarmament, whether in New York, Geneva, or elsewhere. And the proposition from the book that he sent was that no global nuclear treaty which is humanity threatening, whether it is nuclear global disarmament or climate change or global warming, will hold unless three first principles are accepted in principle by the UN General Assembly. I'll just list out the first two, one-line statement each. The supreme national interest must be superseded by the supreme planetary interest. That's a General Assembly resolution. The second, that all humanity-threatening global protocols, once agreed to, like the CTBT, NPT, Chemical Weapons Convention, there should be no opting out clause in the supreme national interest. If you recall, 1972 ABM treaty between Soviet Russia and the USA, it was the linchpin of global security because it prevented the militarization of space. Came George W. Bush, and in 2002, he opted out of that treaty in the supreme national interest, and the result is the militarization of space. So therefore, unless this clause is now accepted for all global treaties, if somebody suspects that an adversary is keeping his options open, then I too must keep my powder dry. The third one is a stretched one. I leave it at that. You're going to Oslo, you might like to consider these. Thank you.
We'll collect 2 or 3 more questions. I'd request everybody to keep them brief. Mr. Jayaprakash.
Sorry, the name of the book was Millennium Equipoise? I've lost.
Yeah, Ambassador, you mentioned about the disconnect between the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan and the present policy of the government, which Mr. Sibyl has illustrated. In this context, today, actually, India is willing to sign the NPT. That is what we fear from the peace movement. But the condition is that they want to sign it as a nuclear weapon power. Although India was the first country to propose the NPT in the first place, even in the CTBT. But subsequently it opposed because it does nothing to do with disarmament. That is why it opted out of NPT. Secondly, there was this McLaws-Zorin Accord, which was signed on 20th September 1961 on general and complete disarmament, which was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly on 20th December 1961. And the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan is the latest version of that. That way, India has a record. But today, after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, India is pursuing a totally different policy. And as far as the CTBT is concerned, it doesn't even define what constitutes a nuclear weapon test. It's the only treaty without definitions. And what are you actually signing, if that's the case?
Yeah. General
Banerjee.
We haven't even discussed the possibility of the worst weapon falling into the worst hands and therefore the catastrophic consequences of that development. Nevertheless, I think it's a pity that having accepted the devastating consequences of any sort of nuclear weapons use, and not even nuclear weapons use, we are still so complacent about addressing the possibility of a nuclear weapons-free world. Of course, there's little international debate today. Even within India, where I think we should agree that the Indian security interests will be enhanced in a non-nuclear weapons environment, both regionally as well as globally. In spite of that, the argument that we see within the country is the justification of why we can and continue to take various steps, which does not compel us to do anything at all. Where we have the guideline of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, which of course in 1988 nobody even actually read it very much, and only the nuclear weapons disarmamentists in the Global Zero campaign, etc., recognized it only 20 years later. Yet we have these initiatives. Of course, some of the initiatives will have to start within the region. And here, India, Pakistan, China, I think constitute one group of countries where in today's environment, the possibility of some sort of a nuclear weapons use cannot be ruled out. And hence, a dialogue addressing this could be a process towards nuclear weapons disarmament. Of course, I have been instrumental in getting 5 rounds of this trilateral dialogue. The 6th round is next. At the track 2 level, nothing much gets done. But the surprising thing from an Indian perspective is the lack of acceptance of the possibility that a Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan can actually be fructified through global, considered, and international effort. That's something perhaps I wonder if many of our Indian speakers would like to address. Sorry.
Can I? Yes, the gentleman in the back there.
I would like to ask 2 questions. One is, with specific reference to Korea, China, and Pakistan, to what extent is the nuclearization program linked to gaining a psychological superiority, whether justified or unjustified? Number 2, to what extent is it also meant to give legitimacy to the regime that is existing in these countries?
Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, ma'am.
I wanted to, Yelena Sokol from the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I wanted to ask Mr. Iyer and Mr. Sibal, you both mentioned in your presentation many aspects of bilateral possibilities in the region to start some discussions. But on the other hand, it is the region here, both India, Pakistan, and China, where the nuclear doctrines and nuclear strategies are the least transparent, so to speak. There is not even open public documents that are in the discussion first. And second, that I wanted to ask you about you mentioned it, the minimum credible deterrence. That is still something that countries are trying to define. Where is that minimum deterrence is? And in just my personal observation is, while we are speaking about disarmament, but as a first step, some kind of a arms control agreement in the region, where some of the limitations of escalation that you mentioned the escalator, but there is a potential to get on that escalator and it will start running really fast. You know, one of the measures to prevent that escalation is building the transparency. It is what actually brought US and the USSR to go down and limit some of the transparency, the dialogue. So I would like you to address this issue. Thank you.
I'll now invite Ambassador Clement to respond to issues raised by the panel as well as on the floor.
Thank you. It's, of course, extremely interesting for me, but there are so many points that I would like to make, and there is no time to do that, so I will probably choose a few random ones. I'm absolutely defenseless on the argument on the Congress of Vienna. I have, other than take full blame for what Mr. Metternich did at the time. On the point, security environment, and if Austria were India, we would, I mean, of course, where you sit depends on where you stand. No, sorry, it's the other way around. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And of course, as I said at the beginning, we are in a very good security environment at the moment, but we have for a long time been really the front line, and there were nuclear weapons use scenarios on Austria. So you can say we were for many decades in a geopolitical situation like Nepal, to give you an example. So on the point of if Austria were India, and why making the choice to go for nuclear weapons, that goes to the core of the question on the validity of the concept of deterrence. I tried to make some points. I fully understand India is in a very, very difficult security environment. I fully understand that Pakistan and India and China give rise to very serious security concerns in India. But I mean, the key question is, and that is the problem that a non-nuclear weapon state like Austria has, that the nuclear weapons debate is decided by national policies and the repercussions are global. And that's the frustration from a non-nuclear weapon state working in the multilateral system for decades without any real breakthrough. Whereas India looks at this issue, I believe, not so much from a point of view, what is the global state, what is the health of a regime, because you have issues with the way the regime has been constructed. So you look at these issues primarily from a national security point of view, which is understandable. We look at it from a point of view of a non-nuclear weapon state that wants to get rid of this threat. So I believe I understand to the extent possible the security problems that India is facing. So it's clear that deterrence is really the only mission that nuclear weapons can support, but there's no evidence that it works. There are declassified archives from the Cold War now that actually there was never a real plan of an attack between US and the Soviet Union, so we don't know. What we know is that during the course of the Cold War, there have been numerous occasions and afterwards where we actually came very close, either through miscalculation, And there is today a grave threat of cyber, of miscalculation, of the risk of escalating tensions to the nuclear level. So it's not, I'm not singling out the situation between India and Pakistan. It is really a concern about nuclear weapons as such. So nuclear deterrence works as long as nuclear weapons are not used, but you cannot I mean, the absence of proof proof by absence is an extremely weak basis to put the security of the world on. If I can make another couple of points on the sort of the moral issue, I think that's an important one because, I mean, the fact that there is now much more open discussion between sort of the NPT regime and India, I think is a very good sign, and it's a sign that we are moving on from sort of throwing formalized dogmatic views at each other, and I think that's an extremely important development. But from the Austrian viewpoint of a non-nuclear weapon state, there is something specific about the Indian decision, because India has been the moral voice against nuclear weapons as such. I mean, Russia and US nuclear weapons are the result of the Cold War. The question was asked, why is the reason for France and UK to have them? I think it's very clear. It's the reasons to go to develop is the power status that I mentioned, is to retain fading power status. In the case of China, it was the wish of gaining this power status. And these are the five. And then is the Indian decision. I understand it was a reluctant decision, but nevertheless, India was the moral voice against the folly of the bipolar confrontation. And if India then also buys into the logic of deterrence as a reason and gives reason of its own security needs, what it then actually means, because of the moral stance that India had taken, is that the arguments that nuclear deterrence is a necessity that was put forward by the nuclear weapon states is essentially validated by India. And that, I think, from the non-nuclear weapon state perspective of Austria is tragic, because what it means is that it then only becomes a debate which security threat justifies nuclear weapons, rather than the moral stance against nuclear weapons as such. And I think this is a specific issue for India because of the very, very proactive role that India has played. Just two more points. The argument was made, well, we have a credible process, multilateral process, and we should stick to it. It's a step-by-step process. Well, it's not credible. That's the problem. There is the CTBT, which is not entering into force. By the way, the argument that it's impossible for India to ratify the treaty before India and the US, I would just say that the treaty doesn't enter into force until the others have done that too. So India would not bind itself because the treaty only enters into force if China and the US would ratify. So India could actually take a very, very strong moral stance in trying to generate momentum towards ratification without actually being bound by international law. So I mean, if there is, I understand the reasons why India says we want to wait for those two countries, but actually you can turn it around and say, well, if there is a real need to strengthen the norm, India could take the lead without actually jeopardizing its security views in that respect in any way. And on the FMCT, the reasons are very clear. There is the Conference on Disarmament is blocked because Pakistan blocks it. There is no way of applying pressure on Pakistan because Pakistan wants to be seen as blocking the start of negotiations on FMCT as a result of the nuclear deal with India. And Pakistan has made it very clear that they want to have the similar deal, which of course is not in the books at the moment. So the situation is completely frozen. And even if it were unfrozen, even if negotiations were to start, we all know on the very next day it would be stuck again, because then the question comes, are we actually talking about a non-proliferation treaty, or are we talking about a disarmament treaty which would include stockpiles? So I don't know what the Indian phrase of we support an FMCT that takes into account our strategic national security interest would mean, if it means including stocks or not. But from the Austrian and the sort of multilateralist point of view, it's not really a credible process because the CD is stuck for the foreseeable future, and even if it were unstuck, we wouldn't really get anywhere. And just my very last point because you said my prediction that more and more states would develop. It's true, it's not right now, but I was giving a long-termish view. It's very clear just the interest in nuclear energy that is poised to grow. We all talk about it. Austria doesn't like it because we have a constitutional issue with it, but it is poised to grow. And simply the interest and the technology, the technological spread for nuclear energy for peaceful purposes will increase the capability of states to reach this threshold. So we are really in a very precarious situation. I think it is time to stop with these dogmatic views and really start to make progress. Thank you.
Okay. I'll take responses from the panel. Prabhat, you want to start?
Well, I think the only question that was asked of me is about the question of the CTBT treaty. Well, I think there are 2 points made. One is that, yes, the basic problem is political, which is an unwillingness on the Indian side to, as you said, go ahead when the fact that China and the United States have declined to sign the treaty or ratify the treaty. But keep in mind that if we do ratify, even if, as you said, there is an exemption under international law, I could make the argument for an exemption, it would effectively be the law of the Indian land. I mean, Indian Parliament would have effectively said we will not carry out a nuclear test. And you might have a weasel clause inside saying, but if this treaty does not come into force, and so on. But ultimately, what tends to happen in India is that we take these treaties very seriously. Even with these weasel clauses, it would effectively stop us from testing. There was a study done by the U.S. State Department during the Clinton administration, an internal study. I never saw it, but I was told about it, where they actually looked at India's record on international treaty obligations. And they actually said that they concluded that, in fact, India had a better record than the United States did. That India, when it signs a treaty, even if the rest of the international system may go off on its own path, India, because it sees it as becoming part of its own national law, then abides by that treaty very strictly. And it's something that the Americans actually said that other countries actually use this as a negotiating ploy against India. They know that once we get you to sign, after that, India is fixed. The problem is getting us to sign, which is when we know that we get into this trap, so therefore we avoid signing. But that there is there, and I think we in the Indian side know about this problem. CTBT, I agree, it was always considered, I think, a symbolic gesture as far as it was really about developing a momentum towards a broader disarmament movement. And it was not considered necessarily an important part of actually reducing them. It doesn't reduce any warheads or anything. It just freezes the capacity of countries to develop new warheads. And I think the idea was always...
Through testing. I mean, it allows them to develop through other means.
Yeah, but it just basically says the idea was if you went for CTBT, you were making a political commitment by your government that you were then going to move on to the next stage. And right now, that momentum, as I think we all know, has been completely dissipated over the past 10 years. And we'll see if Obama decides to go through with his unilateral cuts. His idea, obviously, is to see if he can start to revive some sort of process again. But I agree, CTBT is not at the core of disarmament, but it's part of a broader issue of, if you wish, public diplomacy on that issue.
Yeah, insofar as India's nuclear doctrine is concerned, it's available. The text is available. It's public, and you can go through it. In fact, we made the point immediately after nuclear tests that we very quickly started discussing a nuclear doctrine. And initially, it was issued by the National Security Advisory Board. And we prided ourselves on the fact that we were trying, after our nuclear tests, to be as transparent as possible. And no other country had declared a nuclear doctrine so quickly after doing the tests. And in fact, countries like China, we don't know what their nuclear doctrine is. They haven't published anything. So I think on factually, what you said doesn't seem to be correct. So far as India entering arms control is concerned. Now, the odd thing is that the only two nuclear powers which are engaged in arms control negotiations are US and Russia. But France and UK and China are not part of any disarmament negotiations. France says that unilaterally it has reduced its nuclear weapons, it has got rid of certain missiles there, and they're only relying on their sea-based deterrent, and et cetera, et cetera. In fact, they got rid of all their missiles. They only have airborne stuff and submarines. I don't know what the British say about this. But China's position is they will enter into this discussion only after the principal nuclear weapon states have reduced their nuclear arms further. Currently, under the New START Treaty, as you well know, 1550 nuclear weapons with both sides, plus they are allowed to keep any number of stockpile weapons, unoperational stockpile weapons, so which means literally thousands. So I look upon this disarmament a bit more cynically than some may. It is more a question of managing their nuclear arsenals in the political, military, and economic context of the end of the Cold War. It is not disarmament. It is more a management and reduction, which is more rational in terms of the actual threats that are being faced. And the latest statement by President Obama of further tests reducing them, nuclear weapons reducing them to 1,000 or 1,100 has been treated very negatively by Russia, saying that firstly any further step would be taken after 2021 when the New START Treaty expires. And number two, that the anti-ballistic missile system with the United States putting up in Europe, that issue must be resolved first. So I don't think we need to be particularly impressed by the commitment of the two principal powers to nuclear disarmament. Insofar as specifically our issue is concerned, China doesn't recognize India as a nuclear weapons state, and they don't want to enter into nuclear talks with us. Because if they did, it will be indirect recognition of India as a nuclear weapons state. And then we have the China-Pakistan cooperation. So how can we have any trilateral China-Pakistan India discussions on nuclear matters, given the problems that I have mentioned? Insofar as the point that you made that during the Cold War there were incidents which could have led to some kind of a nuclear war, and there could be potential for miscalculation. Now, if these things were real and these things are so pressing, and if the reports that have emerged are so worrisome, then I can't see how rational people, President Obama, Putin, or all the other Western leaders, are not learning these lessons. Why are they not learning these lessons? And if they are not learning the lessons, then how do they expect us to learn lessons from their own experience, which they are not willing to learn? So I think this is not a very persuasive argument, frankly. And finally, with regard to the moral voice, I think this is an unfair stick to beat India with, because we had a certain position which we maintained over a few decades, and nobody heard our voice. And now suddenly we are saying that, you know, the position that you took many, many years ago, which nobody listened to, now you take as if the moral voice we'll raise today will have more impact on the ground when it didn't have for 2, 3, 4 decades. I can't see how, if India took the lead, it's going to make any difference on the ground, because the principal nuclear weapon states are going to take decisions based on what they think is necessary, not only for their national security, but what is acceptable to the domestic political constituencies. So that debate is totally disconnected with any position that India may take. But a few things India does say, which says that, okay, remove the weapons from alert status, demate them, delegitimize them, no first use convention, convention on prohibition of nuclear weapons. These are practical suggestions we make. This is a moral voice, but nobody is listening. Nobody is listening even to these practical suggestions, which need not mean elimination of nuclear weapons, but a progressive, how should I say, reducing the salience of nuclear weapons progressively. Even that voice is not heard. So I don't buy the argument of India using its moral voice as if we will be able to convert others to our point of view.
Mr. Manishankar Iyer.
Well, the report that my group prepared for the Prime Minister pointed out that when we did take what you call the moral position, nobody listened. And that was because it was believed that our moral position was actually a hypocritical position, that we were pretending to be in favor of global nuclear disarmament when our true intention was to make the bomb. So we say that if then we lacked credibility, now when we have the bomb, if we continue to take what you call the moral position and what I call the only practical position, which is global nuclear disarmament, then perhaps our championship of this movement will have more credibility now than it did in the past. But unfortunately, almost all those who would have been our natural partners don't trust us because we made the bomb. So when we didn't make the bomb, we weren't trusted. And when we do make the bomb, we're still not trusted, which puts us in the somewhat awkward position of saying, let's become completely pragmatic and do what everybody else does, which is to have the bomb, want it, continue to keep it, hope that it wouldn't be used, but be ready to use it in the event that it is going to be used, and talk disarmament. Well, my own personal position, and I think that of at least my colleagues in that group, was much more sincere. We see India's national security, our supreme national interest, as lying in ridding ourselves of these nuclear weapons. It's not an idealistic position, although it could be portrayed as such. It's a completely pragmatic, practical thing that if we have the bomb, for whatever reason and by whatever route we got to it, since I don't accept the position that was underlying Kanwal's position, has been underlying it for a long time, that we are a very noble country and that Pakistan is the embodiment of everything that is awful in the world. Since I don't accept that position, I think instead of arguing did they start it, did we start it, the fact is that today we've both got this bomb. It's most unlikely that in any conventional sense we are either of us going to use the bomb against the other. But if one looks at why that Congress of Vienna broke down, and I think that's very, very relevant to all of it. From 1815 till 1914, a document of the balance, a doctrine of the balance of power actually kept the peace. How did it collapse? It collapsed because Archduke Ferdinand got married on the 28th of June, 1900. And he got married to a really rather attractive young woman, but who wasn't quite his peer. And therefore, it was a morganatic marriage. And on no occasion was his wife allowed to stand on the same platform with him in protocol terms. Then you captured Bosnia-Herzegovina. And when you did that, he was made the commander-in-chief of the Bosnian army. And he inquired whether he could take his wife there. And they said that since Bosnia was not quite part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as commander-in-chief, his wife could accompany him. And so he took her to Sarajevo. And he chose as the date to go to Sarajevo the 28th of June, 1914. And therefore, the story of the First World War is a story of love, not a story of hate. Now, if it is so uncertain as to when you're going to tipple over, and most people thought that since the last major war fought by the European powers among themselves had lasted from about breakfast till tea time at Waterloo, that maybe this time, because we are more sophisticated, it will last until the leaves fall. That was the expression. Our armies will be back before the leaves fall. And then they said, no, our boys will be back by Christmas. And then after 4 years, when the seesaw went on, and nobody really knew who was going to win, the ultimate weapon produced by the Germans, and you were in collaboration with them at that time, was that we'll have these submarines which will deter everybody. And the Zimmermann telegram got revealed, and after the revelation of that telegram, the Americans had no alternative but to come in, and ultimately the balance of power turned out to be a terrible destruction. The worst of the war was between 1916 and 1918. So this entire doctrine of balancing Pakistan, I don't want to balance Pakistan. It's such an inferior country. Why should I be in balance with them? But, the whole of our nuclear doctrine is based on that. It seems to me that if we accept the idea that was implicit in the lady's question to me as to, I think it was implicit, it was not explicit, that why don't we do the CTBT and the FMCT? I don't think it matters. These matter only if they are part of they are links in a chain that leads to the elimination of nuclear weapons. So India was not only, as was pointed out, the first country to propose the NPT, but we proposed it as a non-discriminatory measure. We were also the first country to put on record that we want the CTBT and we want the FMCT as part of the Rajiv Gandhi program. But that program was linked to a time-bound road towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So if you don't eliminate nuclear weapons by having the CTBT, it hardly matters whether you have the CTBT or you don't have the CTBT, or if you have the FMCT or you don't have the FMCT. What are you prioritizing? Freezing nuclear capabilities at a point where those who have large stocks of weapons can continue to be in full charge of the international order? Or are you really moving towards the democratization of the national order? And therefore my plea to you is that when you and other countries were blocking our attempt to get this civil nuclear deal through with NSG approval, the expression used in the Indian Foreign Service about your country was that this is the Gang of Six. And in cabinet, I argued that they are the only countries that are upholding everything we've stood for. So during this period, we must go back to becoming the best of friends with the Gang of Six and not be involved with this other Gang of Six, which is the Gang of Nuclear Weapon Powers. So we have argued this is not mentioned in the report, but we've argued that we must be in very close relations with the group of countries that is standing for global nuclear disarmament, but doesn't think that we are worthy of becoming a member of their club. So if this discussion actually leads to a certain restoration of trust on the part of the non-nuclear weapon, the non-nuclear Western powers who still continue to enjoy the nuclear umbrella, even as they talk of nuclear disarmament, then maybe there is a fruitful ground for us to talk. But I don't think anybody would not wish to have a dialogue with Austria in such a gorgeous capital as Vienna, which was built as a monument to Metternich and everything that he achieved. But we're ready to go there, we're ready to talk. Much more important is, are we ready to talk about these issues with Pakistan, with China? Are we ready to talk about it even with the United States of America? We don't seem to be ready to do that now. We're not even ready to appoint a special envoy for disarmament affairs. Obviously, the best person to be that is me. But since the obvious choice is not acceptable to the government of India, why don't we have a suboptimal choice, as name common as that? But I think we need to earnestly get on with the agenda, and that agenda was a totally practical one, beginning on the day of Hiroshima. For that was Gandhi's first reaction. He just said, this is a bomb that can never be destroyed by bombs. And therefore, the only answer lies in nonviolence. You can portray that as a moral position, you can portray that as an idealistic position, or you can portray it, as I do, as a completely practical proposition. And to realize that ambition, that you can't defeat the bomb with the bomb. We have a very complicated technical exercise to go through, and that too with a multiplicity of countries that have a multiplicity of national interests. So it must begin with dialogue, and that dialogue has to be at the governmental rather than my kind of level, because we don't count, but those in the establishment do. So if only the establishments would talk with each other, maybe we can get somewhere. I do believe that it could set the stage, a series of complementary bilateral dialogues for a multilateral discussion in Geneva, leading to a multilateral negotiation. But if Pakistan has given you the golden opportunity of getting off the hook on global disarmament, then I suggest that you don't fall for this bait. Let them say what they want on FMCT. You follow our route on CTBT, which is to unilaterally declare your adherence, and then get on with the real task, which is negotiating a convention which will abolish nuclear weapons and delegitimize the possession of these weapons. Thank you.
I would, we're really running out of time, so I'm not going to, okay.
Agree on non-use against non-nuclear weapon states. So can't the three of you come to, all three have given non-use against non-nuclear weapon states. You can take the initiative on no first use. And similarly, Ambassador, why don't you take a position on no first use?
It's not true of Pakistan. China, yes.
No, Pakistan has given an undertaking not to use against non-nuclear weapon states.
They haven't accepted no first use, but they've accepted non-nuclear.
No use against non-nuclear weapon states.
And if you read any speeches in Geneva, you will not know if it's an Indian or a Pakistani speaking until you get to the last paragraph. The rest of the position.
Okay, I think we need to, I think we need to, you've posed your question, I need to summarize and wrap things up. I mean, in the summer of 2008, I spent I made 3 separate visits that were quite, as a reporter, to Vienna to cover first the meeting of the Board of Governors where India's safeguards agreement was up for discussion, and then the 2 meetings of the NSG, especially the second one which dragged on, and I was part of the group of reporters who had to pound the pavement outside the Japanese mission at the IAEA. Before finally news came out that the exemption had been cleared. And I, like Ambassador Manishankar, I had left Vienna at the end of the last of those meetings in 2008, fully aware of the enormous difficulty that countries like Austria or Ireland or New Zealand went through, the wrenching, decision-making process. Which was informed by debates within your own society, civil society, all kinds of views, objecting to what some people said was a sellout. And despite that, I think your governments took the right decision. India made various commitments. And I left Austria or Vienna at the end of that 3rd meeting, convinced that it was essential for India to find common ground, like as Manishankar said, for us to be in dialogue with this group of 6 countries and others like them who are sincere about the goal of nuclear disarmament. And with the same, it was with the same belief that I took part in Ambassador Manishankar's group, which worked on the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. I should mention here, put my cards on the table, I was perhaps the only person on this panel who in 1998, when India tested, wrote an op-ed criticizing the test. And, but at the same time, I was realistic enough to recognize that the genie cannot be put back in the bottle, and that the only silver lining to what we had done, whatever the motivations were, whatever the pressures were, was that we had to now use our newfound status as a country with nuclear weapons to actually push the cause for getting rid of these weapons at the global level with greater vigor and greater sincerity. And I think the kind of steps that we've outlined, the importance of no first use, non-use, these are practical steps that need the support of countries like Austria, I think, because the CTBT, FMCT, these are tracks that we have that exist, but they will not take the world closer to the elimination of these weapons. And I think it's a welcome development that you are in Delhi, Ambassador Clement, and that you will be in dialogue with your counterparts in the government of India. And I hope that this is the first of many such interactions at different levels between Austria and India and other countries of the Group of Six, and indeed key non-aligned countries that have very strong views, South Africa, for example. So that some of these steps that exist in the alternative vector that India is pushing, which we feel is more practical and in many ways more urgent, because long after the CTBT enters into force, the temptation of the nuclear weapon states to use these weapons, will continue to exist, and it's important that there be some effort made to bind the 8 countries, 9 now if you include DPRK, to bind these countries in treaties that, first of all, accept that none of us should be the first to use these weapons, and secondly, that none of these weapons should ever be used. So just like you have a BWC or CWC, and an NWC, a nuclear weapons convention, is it's a goal that is possible, and it's a goal that has to be pursued, and I believe will pay richer dividends towards the elimination of nuclear weapons than focusing exclusively on the CTBT or even the FMCT. With those words, I would like to thank the panelists as well as the audience. You've been very patient for sitting through this discussion, and I hope that there's been some clarity at the end of the differences. Yeah.
No, you just said that we cannot put any pressure on Pakistan. But I find that a lot of pressure is being put on Iran. And Iran is being constantly squeezed. So why is it that you feel helpless when it comes to Pakistan? And you are willing to use all means to squeeze even the oil trade of Iran. And oil is a commodity that the world needs. So I think there needs to be a little more transparency and clarity about the Western position on Pakistan.
We'll treat this as a rhetorical statement that can be addressed. I think we have to end this unless you want to have a 2-minute answer on this. No. I think. Thank you very much.